Tonight, we step into the Forbidden City on a still and sweltering summer afternoon in the Qing Dynasty. The deep blue silk of a minor official's robe clings to the small of his back. The heavy heat sits upon the courtyards, a thick and silent blanket. Somewhere beyond the vermilion walls, the drone of cicadas pulses like a slow drum. Servants move slowly in the shade, their tasks subdued by the sun. This story is not about grand audiences or imperial decrees. It is about a simple, precious moment of relief. Our official has just returned from the government icehouse, a deep cellar of stone and cold earth. He carries a large, clear block of ice, its weight solid in his hands. Now, in the dim quiet of his quarters, he opens the lid of a beautifully carved wooden icebox. He places the heavy, glistening block inside with great care. He lowers the lid, and for a moment, he simply waits. Then, it comes the first, faint whisper of coolness rising from the ornate vents, a gentle breath in the stagnant air. He closes his eyes, and for just a moment, the endless summer retreats. The air above the Forbidden City in July is the kind of hot that has weight to it, a pressing, still, dusty heat that sits between the red walls and the yellow tiles and refuses to move, and you have been standing in it long enough to understand, with complete clarity, why the most powerful empire on earth spent half its winter preparing for this moment. Good evening. Tonight we're going somewhere that might surprise you. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not a scholar's library or a general's tent. We're going to the Forbidden City in summer, and we're going to follow a block of ice. You breathe in. The air is hot, not pleasantly warm, not the kind of warmth that feels like an invitation. This is Beijing in high summer. Inside walls that trap the heat and hold it close. The glazed tiles on every rooftop have been baking since dawn. The flagstones radiate it back upward. The silk of your robe is damp before you've walked 30 steps. The palace stretches around you in every direction. Red walls, curved roof lines, gold ornament catching a sun that seems closer here than it does anywhere else. Eunuchs and servants move slowly, fanning themselves with whatever is available. Even the guards, men in full armor, look like they are trying to take up as little of the hot air as possible. And somewhere in the cool, deep earth beneath this blazing compound, sealed behind thick brick walls and packed in dry straw, something is waiting. Ice, cut from frozen rivers in January, carried here on sleds and carts, locked away in vaulted underground cellars, kept cold through spring, and into this, the most hostile season of the year. You might think, it's just hot. People manage heat. But in a palace where food spoilage meant someone's execution, where court ritual required heavy, layered robes regardless of the weather, where every detail of life was a statement about the order of the universe, heat was not something you simply endured. Heat was a problem that the empire mobilized entire departments to solve. Ice was not a luxury here. It was a strategic resource. It was a signal that the dynasty controlled even the seasons, that the emperor's household could call upon winter's cold in the height of summer, that the natural world, like everything else, was at the service of the throne. The Qing Dynasty poet records a summer banquet held by Yang Guozhong, the powerful minister, where enormous blocks of ice were carved into mountains and arranged around the tables, and the guests grew cold enough in the middle of July that they asked for their coats. That was a different dynasty and several centuries earlier, but the idea was the same. Ice was power made visible. Ice was the empire saying, "We can reverse winter." You stand in the baking courtyard, sweat moving slowly at your temple, the whole sky an aching blue, and somewhere underground beneath your feet, perhaps something cold is sleeping, patient, waiting. This is where the story begins. There is a sound in an old poem, 2 characters, written as the noise of something striking, something repeatedly on a cold morning, and scholars have been reading it for 2,500 years, without ever quite agreeing on exactly how it sounded. But most of them agree it was the sound of ice being cut, in winter, from a frozen river, by people who understood that what they were doing was not merely gathering cold water, but was storing the future. The Qing Dynasty did not invent the royal ice system. They inherited it. The way you inherit a house that has been added to and renovated for 30 generations, you might not recognize the original structure anymore, but it's there, underneath everything. The earliest written record of organized ice harvesting in China is in the Book of Songs, 2,500 years old. It describes men going to cut ice in the 12th month, the sound of chipping, the cold, the work, and then the ice being carried to a place called the Linyan, the ice cellar, stored there, waiting. Archaeologists in Shaanxi found a spring and autumn period ice cellar at the old Qin capital. It could hold nearly 200 cubic meters of ice. This was a state facility, a national cold storage warehouse, 2,300 years ago. The Zhou dynasty, even older, had an official called the Lingren, the ice official, a government position, a real one, with a title and duties and a place in the bureaucratic hierarchy. This person's entire job was the management of ice, its collection, storage, and distribution. Just hearing the title, the ice official, you can feel something cool moving through a document that is otherwise dusty and old. The uses of ice in ancient China were various. The most practical was preservation food kept cold in summer, meat for sacrificial ceremonies, which had to be fresh and pure, or it was considered disrespectful, bodies preserved between death and burial, and of course, perhaps most importantly, across all the centuries, the cold drink. The songs of Chu, the great anthology of southern Chinese poetry, contains a line that translates approximately as "the strained wine, frozen, chilled, how cool, how clear, filtered wine placed on ice and drunk cold." This is possibly the earliest recorded royal cold beverage in Chinese history, and it sounds, across all that distance, entirely appealing. The Zhou ritual texts describe 6 official cold beverages: water, grain drinks, rice drinks, millet drinks, varieties of chilled preparations. Scholars have been arguing for centuries about exactly what they were and how they were made. The ingredients survive in the texts. The flavor is gone. It remains in the imagination only. What is not gone is the logic behind all of it. From the Qing Dynasty onward, managing ice was a function of the state, not a personal indulgence, not a private convenience, a system, organized, funded, staffed, regulated, because controlling the cold, bringing winter into summer, extending the reach of preservation beyond the natural season, was a form of mastery over nature. And mastery over nature was what a dynasty was supposed to demonstrate. The Qing emperors, standing in their summer courts surrounded by eunuchs with fans, were drawing on 3,000 years of institutional memory. Every block of ice that came up from the cellar carried the weight of all that history. Every cold drink served on a lacquered tray was also, in its way, a connection to every cold drink served before it, back and back and back, to a man with a chisel on a frozen river. In a poem so old no one alive can say with certainty how the first character was pronounced. You listen for the sound of that chisel, faint, regular, patient, like something being built one strike at a time. The Forbidden City's summer comfort began in late autumn, when the officials of the Ministry of Works started looking at the sky and calculating the weeks until the rivers froze, and the first orders went out for something that had no modern equivalent, the ritual cleaning of the waterways from which the imperial ice would be cut, a practice so careful and deliberate that it treated the future ice as though it were already a sacred object, long before it had even formed. The heat of summer has not yet arrived. The summer you are heading toward is still months away, but the preparations for it have already begun. It is late autumn. The air above Beijing has gone dry and clear. The leaves have come down from the trees in the imperial gardens. The eaves of the palace buildings are sharp against a sky that is getting colder by the week. And somewhere in the Ministry of Works, an official is writing a memo. The subject is the rivers that will freeze, the rivers from which next summer's ice will be cut. The Forbidden City's moat, Beihai Lake, Zhongnanhai, the Imperial Canal. These waterways are the designated sources, close enough for efficient transport, clean enough in theory for imperial standards. Before the freeze, there is work to do. The Chinese term for it translates approximately as rinsing the river. Workers go into the water. They remove aquatic plants from the designated harvesting sections. They clear debris. Then the upstream sluice gates are opened, and clean water is flushed through the system. The downstream gates are closed. Fresh, clean water is held in place, and the waiting begins. The logic is straightforward. The emperor's ice must be clear, pure ice, not murky or plant-tangled or carrying the flavor of something that shouldn't be there. If a piece of river grass found its way into a cold drink served at court, the official responsible would be looking for a new career, possibly something less demanding, in a different province. After the rinsing, the waiting. The officials monitor the temperature. They check the ice daily once it begins to form, measuring thickness with poles. The ideal harvest window is roughly 2 weeks after the winter solstice, when the ice is thick enough to be safe, dense enough to be worth cutting, and still has the season ahead of it to remain solid. Too early and the ice is thin. Too late and a warm spell might undo everything. The quantity guidelines are precise. The rule is called 3-to-1. Harvest 3 times what you expect to use, because ice melts, in transit, in storage. No matter how well the cellars are built, some percentage is lost to time. You cannot arrive at August with empty cellars because you calculated optimistically in January. The emperor is not equipped to hear the words, "We ran out." More cold than you need is always safer than less. In the older dynasties, the Zhou ritual texts describe ceremonies before the ice harvest offerings made to the deity of cold, peachwood boughs and thornwood arrows placed in the ice chamber to ward off anything malevolent. Peachwood, because peach sounds like the word for driving away ill fortune. Thornwood, because thorns repel. Whether the Qing court maintained any version of these rituals, historians are still working to determine. The official records focus on logistics and quantities. The ritual details, if they existed, were not considered worth writing down. But the thoroughness of the rinsing, the precision of the timing rules, the 3-to-1 margin, all of this carries a quality of reverence that needs no ceremony to make itself felt. These people treated future ice as something that deserved careful preparation, as something worth doing slowly and correctly. The river is clean now. The water is still. The temperature drops a degree each night. A thin skin appears at the edges first, then spreads inward, thickens, hardens. The waiting continues. Steady, patient, cold, doing it slow, reliable work. The workers who went out onto the ice in January were called ice laborers, or ice conscripts, depending on their status, and almost everything about their specific lives, their names, their wages, their origins, whether they were volunteers or assigned, what happened to their families when the work was done, has been swallowed by the general silence that official records tend to maintain about people who were not officials. The winter solstice has passed. 2 weeks have gone by. The ice on the imperial waterways is thick enough. You pull your coat tighter. You follow the work party down to the river. The surface is broad and flat and slightly luminous in the low winter sun. It stretches further than you can easily see from where you stand at the bank. The kind of cold that the ice gives off has its own quality, not just the cold of the air, but something harder, more mineral, rising from below. The workers are already out there. You can see their breath from here, small clouds appearing and disappearing above dozens of moving figures. Their cheeks and noses are red. Their hands are wrapped in cloth, though the cloth does not keep out everything. The primary tool is called the bingshuan, the ice pick. It has a sharp metal head and a long wooden handle. The weight of it is designed for striking to chip, to score, to open the ice along a chosen line. Some of the workers use it like a hoe, driving it down again and again into the surface, following a grid they have marked out in advance. Others use it to pry and lever once the cuts have been made. The sound carries across the frozen surface, a rhythmic striking, then a heavier crack, the sound of a block separating from the sheet around it, then voices, the coordination of several men pulling together. Each block is large, around 80 kilograms, the weight of a full-grown man. It takes multiple workers to drag one block out of the hole it leaves, using ropes and iron hooks to maneuver it across the ice to the waiting sleds at the bank. The earlier Qing Dynasty records specify dimensions, a chi and a half on each side, roughly half a meter square. The Qing records are more precise about weight than measurement. Either way, this is not a task for one person. Once the first layer of ice is harvested, the water below will freeze again. The same site can be worked again and again, 3 or 4 rounds in a single winter from the same stretch of river. This means the workers are on the ice for much of the coldest months, not a few days of dramatic labor, but weeks of repetitive, physically punishing work. Cold hands that barely warm between sessions, ice that is never quite the same surface twice after the first cutting. What we know about these workers comes mostly from what the official records don't say about them. They are mentioned the way background appears in a painting as context, not subject. They exist in the documents primarily as a quantity and a logistical requirement. Their names don't survive. Their wages, when mentioned, are mentioned in aggregate. What they thought about the work, whether they had any sense of where these enormous blocks of river ice were ultimately going, whether they ever received anything cold to drink in the summer, none of this is recorded. Historians are still attempting to piece together who these people were. Were they seasonal contract workers? Conscripted laborers assigned from the banner system? Specialists who passed the work from father to son? The evidence is scattered and incomplete. What is certain is that without them, in the most literal sense, the Forbidden City's summer would have been hotter. The cold drinks wouldn't have been cold. The food storage would have been less reliable. Every chilled moment enjoyed inside those red walls from May through July was bought with this labor. In this cold, on this ice. A block breaks free. Several workers pull it toward the shore on ropes. Their boots scuff across the ice. Their breathing is audible from where you stand. The block heavy, dense, opaque near its edges, translucent at its center, clears the bank and is lifted onto a sled. The next hole is already being cut. The picking continues, regular, steady, unhurried, as though it would go on forever. The ice cellars of the Qing Dynasty sat partially underground and partially above it. Their arched roofs, visible as low mounds at various points around the capital, their thick walls holding something in that was, by the time summer arrived, more valuable than most of what was held in the visible buildings around them, and the engineering that made them work had been refined over centuries to solve a problem. That sounds simple, only if you've never tried to keep 100 tons of ice from becoming 100 tons of water. The sleds move through the winter streets. The blocks are heavy and leave slight impressions in the snow. The destination is not far. Several of the imperial cellars sit within walking distance of the Forbidden City itself. The Shuiqi Ice Cellar, located in what is today Shuiqi Alley, behind Jingshan Hill. built in the Wanli period of the Ming Dynasty, renovated under the Kangxi Emperor of the Qing. Purpose: to hold ice for the exclusive use of the imperial palace. Still standing, partially, today. Still cool inside, even in summer, even without any ice to justify it. The walls remember. You approach the structure. What you see above ground is not impressive in the way that palaces are impressive. No gold, no ornament, just a long, low building, its walls thick and slightly inward-leaning at the top, its roof a shallow arch, 3 or 4 meters from ground to the top of the arch, another 3 meters below ground. Unpretentious on the outside, absolute on the inside. The walls are granite-faced. In some cellars, the interior is completely self-supporting, arched without interior columns, like a city gate tunnel, and described by contemporary records as having bronze sides and iron bottom, which was not literally true but was meant to convey that this structure was not going anywhere. Thickness is the first principle of the ice cellar. The walls are not thick for structural reasons alone. Thickness is insulation. The stone and the packed earth above and around it create a buffer between the inside temperature and the July air outside. The ancient cellars from the pre-Qing period used 3 meters of rammed earth on all 4 sides as the insulating layer. Some used straw packed between the wall layers. The Qing brick cellars inherited this understanding and refined it. The second principle is drainage. Even the best insulated cellar cannot prevent all melting. Some water will always accumulate. If it pools, it accelerates the melting of what's around it. So the cellars were built with drainage in mind, grooved floor tiles that channeled meltwater toward drains connected to pits or channels outside the structure. The pre-Qin cellars at the Qin capital site had ceramic drainage pipes built into the walls, directing meltwater to a nearby stream. 2,000 years later, the principle was the same. Remove the water, keep the cold dry. How many of these cellars were there? The collected statutes of the Qing Dynasty records. 5 cellars inside the Forbidden City itself, 6 at the west gate of Jingshan, 3 at Deshengmen in the north, 2 south of Zhengyang Gate. And these are only the officially documented government cellars. Princes' residences had their own. Other institutions had their own. The full count across the capital in any given year was considerably higher. The total storage capacity of the documented imperial cellars, if each block weighed around 80 kilograms, and estimates of total storage run to approximately 180,000 blocks, comes to something in the range of 14,000 metric tons of ice, 14,000 tons, in underground stone buildings, put there in January, still cold in July. You stand at the entrance to the cellar. The doors are open now, in winter, for loading. You can feel the cold from inside meeting the cold outside, and the two temperatures becoming briefly indistinguishable. Workers move steadily through the entrance with their loads. It is dark inside. What your eyes slowly adjust to is an enormous vaulted space, filling from the deep end outward, block by block, layer by layer. The workers who stacked the ice inside the cellars were not the same as the workers who cut it from the river. And they were not doing simple labor. They were solving a three-dimensional engineering problem in near darkness, working against their own body heat in an environment that would have punished any mistake in placement with an avalanche of ice or a premature thaw, and they were doing it with the knowledge that the summer court's comfort depended entirely on getting it right. The blocks come in steadily, carried, dragged, lowered, each one announced by the sound of it settling against its neighbors. 80 kilograms of dense, cold, slightly luminous river ice. The stacking begins at the furthest point of the cellar and works outward from the deepest interior toward the door, from the floor upward. The workers are experienced. They move without wasted motion. They know, from repetition, exactly how to angle and position each block so that the layers interlock and support each other. Between each block and between each layer, straw or dried wheat stalks, clean, dry, laid flat, or scattered loose, covering all contact surfaces. Two purposes. The straw prevents the blocks from freezing together into a single, immovable mass, and it absorbs the small amount of surface moisture that accumulates as the ice begins to interact with the air. The blocks rise toward the vault, row after row after row, the cellar filling like a very slow, very cold tide. The logistics had their own precise accounting. The cost of transporting a block of ice from the river to one of the cellars inside the Forbidden City, 7 Li, 4 Hao of silver. The cost to one of the more distant cellars outside the walls, 4 Li, 2 Hao. Every fraction of a tale tracked in ledgers that still exist in the imperial archives. Even transportation was precise. Even the price of moving cold from one location to another had a number attached to it. When the cellar is full stacked to within a few feet of the vault ceiling, the doors are closed. The ceiling is methodical. The heavy wooden doors are shut and latched. Then the gaps around the door frame are packed with a mixture of mud and straw, pressed in carefully until no gap remains. The edges are smoothed, checked again. Any opening, even a small one, is a path for warm air to enter and cold air to escape. Nothing is left to chance. From this moment until the cellar is opened in summer, the door will not move. Spring will come, cherry blossoms in the imperial gardens, the plum rains, the temperature climbing week by week, and inside the sealed vault, behind the mud-packed doors, the temperature will hold. Not perfectly, not without some loss, but enough. The door is closed, the mud is pressed into the last gap. The workers step back. Someone makes a mark in a ledger. The cellar is sealed. Inside, 14,000 tons of winter, sleeping, waiting for the heat to arrive, waiting to be useful, patient as stone, cold as the river in January, still, silent, there. The administration of the imperial ice system was divided, in the way that many things in the Qing bureaucracy were divided, between the formal government on one side and the emperor's personal household administration on the other. the Ministry of Works, managing production and storage, and the Imperial Household Department, managing consumption and distribution and the boundary between these two domains, while theoretically clear, was in practice the site of the same kinds of jurisdictional negotiation that characterize large organizations in any era. Every block of ice that came up from those cellars in summer was the product of a bureaucratic chain that began months earlier, with memos and inspections and budget allocations and approved requisitions. The primary government body responsible for the imperial ice system was the Ministry of Works. The Qing Ministry of Works managed construction, hydraulic engineering, roads, bridges, and state infrastructure. Think of it as the combined equivalent of a modern Ministry of Construction, Water Resources, and Public Works. Within it, the Bureau of Water Control, the Dushui handled river management, flood control, and the ice system, the selection of harvesting sites, the rinsing of the rivers, the timing of the harvest, the construction and maintenance of the cellars, the accounting of what went in and what was distributed, all of it under the Ministry of Works. The other institution was the Imperial Household Department, the Neiwufu. If the Ministry of Works was the government, the Imperial Household Department was the Emperor's personal management corporation. It ran everything inside the palace walls: food, clothing, ceremonies, ritual objects, procurement, repairs. The emperor's life was managed through this institution, and since the emperor's summer life included cold drinks and chilled fruit and the need for food preservation, the household department was deeply involved in how ice was used, if not always in how it was produced. One documented example: of the 6 ice cellars at the west gate of Jingshan, 2 were designated for the use of the household department's ceremonial division, specifically for the storage of fruit and food offerings used in certain palace rituals. 2 cellars out of 6 reserved for ceremonial provisions alone. This suggests the demand from the household department was substantial and consistent. You might wonder, did these 2 departments ever disagree about anything? The answer is almost certainly yes, though the specific disagreements, if they were ever written down in a form that survived, have not yet been fully brought to light by historians examining this particular question. Large organizations with overlapping responsibilities and adjacent interests generally find something to negotiate about. The quality of a delivery, the timing of a transfer, whether a particular seller's remaining stock was sufficient. These are the kinds of conversations that happen in the margins of historical records, when they happen at all. What's notable about the ice system's administration is how seriously it was taken. This was not delegated to the lowest available official. It sat within the Ministry of Works, a significant central government institution. It had its own bureau, its own budget lines, its own seasonal calendar. Because in a court where everything was symbolic, running out of ice in August was not merely an inconvenience. It was a failure of order, a visible demonstration that the system had not held, that the dynasty could not deliver, even on something as fundamental as summer cold. The Dushui officials who spent their winters counting ice blocks and their summers writing distribution reports were, in a sense, the unsung architects of imperial comfort, They kept the cold chain intact. They made sure winter arrived on time in July. They are not in any of the famous paintings. Their names are mostly gone. But the system they ran is still visible in the surviving cellar buildings, in the accounting records still preserved in the archives, in the quiet, cool interiors of buildings that were designed, above all, to keep something cold. The ice ticket was a small piece of printed paper, a few inches square, that authorized its holder to collect a specified quantity of ice from a designated government cellar, and it was, in its modest and slightly bureaucratic way, one of the most exclusive documents in the Qing Empire, because possessing one meant that someone at the top of the hierarchy had decided you were the kind of person who deserved to be cold in summer. The cellar doors open in summer, approximately the first day of the 5th lunar month, sometimes on or just after the beginning of summer solar term. The official ice distribution season runs through the end of the 7th month, 2.5 months of cold, measured out in tickets. The system works like this. Before the season begins, the Bureau of Water Control calculates the expected daily needs of every relevant government office in the capital. A schedule is drawn up. Ice tickets are printed small paper vouchers specifying type and quantity. Each eligible office submits a formal written request. Once approved, the office receives its allocation of tickets. With tickets in hand, a representative goes to the designated cellar. The ticket is presented. The ice is released. A record is made. It functions, in essence, like a voucher system for a rationed good, which is exactly what it was. The recipients are not ordinary people. Ice tickets go to the banner nobility, the princes and dukes of the imperial family, to the Grand Secretariat and the 9 ministers of state, to senior officials of the major departments, to the heads of institutions that have specific cold storage needs, like certain ceremonial functions. Allocation varies by rank. A senior official might receive 2 blocks per day for the duration of the season. Others receive less. The principle is transparent. Your rank determines your cold. The social significance is considerable. Receiving imperial ice is not just about the temperature. It is a public signal. When a high official mentions, in conversation, that he received the imperial summer ice allocation, he is communicating something about his standing. Everyone present understands what it means and what it costs in terms of proximity to power. The ice is cold. The status is the point. As for the tickets themselves, what they looked like, whether they carried any decorative elements or anti-counterfeiting marks, almost none have survived. Paper documents from that period are rare in general. Official paper documents issued in small quantities for routine administrative purposes are rarer still. Historians working on this question have found references to the tickets in budget records and procedural descriptions, but the physical objects themselves have mostly vanished. What they looked like in the hand, the color of the ink, the size of the characters, the feel of the paper, exists now only in the gap where documentation runs out. But on the first day of the distribution season, when the cellar doors open and the first cold air escapes into the summer morning, and the first allocation of ice is lifted out and carried to the first official who has been waiting for it, The abstract machinery of bureaucracy becomes something physical and immediate. The cold that was sealed away in January is here now. In July, it made the journey. Half a year of patience and careful management paid off. The ice survived. And the first official to receive his ticket and collect his blocks carries home something that took an entire empire's worth of organization to produce. The winter is inside, solid in his hands, still cold. The bing-bon, the ice vessel, the ice cask, the wooden cold box was not a simple container. It was a designed object, considered carefully by craftsmen who understood, without any formal knowledge of thermodynamics, exactly what materials and geometries would hold cold the longest, remove water the most efficiently, and also, since this was an imperial household item, look beautiful enough to belong in a room where everything had been chosen with the same level of care. The block of ice has been collected. It is here now, in the room, beside the lacquered furniture and the hanging silk and the books on their low tables. But you cannot simply place a block of ice on the floor and walk away. You need something to put it in. The bingban, sometimes called the foreign bucket, a name whose origin historians still debate, since this was a native Chinese design with no obvious foreign connection. But the name stuck in certain records and certain periods, and is one of those small historical puzzles that resists easy resolution. The object itself, a wooden box, wider at the top than at the bottom, roughly trapezoidal in cross-section, made from premium hardwood rosewood, or Chinese pearwood, or close-grained cypress. The outside fitted with 2 copper-carrying rings on opposite sides, 2 copper bands around the body for structural reinforcement, a thick wooden lid on top. Open the lid, a metal lining, lead sheet in some versions, tin in others. This lining serves 2 purposes. First, metal conducts heat poorly, less so than bare wood, so the lining adds an insulating barrier between the cold inside and the warmth outside. Second, the metal is impermeable. It protects the wooden body from the steady drip of meltwater. Inside the metal lining, a removable tray or shelf. Ice goes in the bottom. Food, fruit, and drinks go on the shelf above the ice. Chilled, not frozen. Preserved without direct contact with the cold surface. At the bottom of the box, a small drainage hole. As the ice melts, the water runs through and out, rather than pooling and accelerating further melting. Simple, effective, still the correct engineering answer to the problem 200 years later. On the lid, ventilation holes, usually shaped like coins. Through these holes, the cold air produced by the melting ice escapes upward into the room. This is not incidental. It is the design's second function, air conditioning. Not powerful, not comprehensive, but real, a measurable lowering of temperature in the immediate vicinity of the box, sustained as long as the ice lasts. In a well-proportioned room with a few of these boxes running, the difference would have been perceptible. The collected statutes of the court record the allocations. The Empress Dowager received 2 bingban. The empress received 2. Each noble consort received 1. The numbers decreased by rank, as everything in the palace decreased by rank. Even the size of the cold space available to you was determined by your position in the hierarchy. The most spectacular example of the form that survives today is in the Palace Museum collection, a cloisonné enamel bingban decorated with dragon motifs in wrapped filigree, a functional cold box that is also an artwork. The craftsman who made it understood that in the context of the palace, an object that was only practical was an incomplete object. Everything that served the court had to also express something about the court, even the cold, even the ice vessel, even the drainage hole at the bottom had to be found within something beautiful. You sit near one now. In the long afternoon, the ventilation holes exhale something almost imperceptible, a breath of cold air, rising slowly into the room's warm atmosphere. Not enough to make you shiver, just enough to notice, just enough to remind you that inside this decorated box, a piece of January river is quietly, patiently, doing its job. The winter court of the Qing Dynasty turned the frozen surface of the imperial lakes into an arena, and what happened there each year at the height of cold season was called Bingshi ice play, ice sport, ice performance, and it was simultaneously a military review, a ceremonial occasion, a public entertainment for the court, and, under the Qianlong Emperor, a deliberate political statement about what the dynasty was and where it came from. There is another relationship between the Qing court and ice, not the summer one, the winter one. In late December, the lakes of the Western Garden, the imperial water parks to the west of the Forbidden City, the bodies of water now called Beihai and Zhongnanhai freeze solid. The same water that will be harvested for summer cellars first becomes, for a few weeks, a performance space. The Bingshi, selected from the 8 banners in autumn, trained through the winter solstice period, performing in a formal review by the emperor at the height of cold season. The emperor and his court take their places on a raised pavilion at the lake's edge. The ice stretches out before them. The sky is winter pale. The flags are planted at the starting and finishing positions. The skaters, wearing blade-fitted boots, called bingji, stand at the line. There are several events: speed racing, a straight course from a starting flag to the emperor's pavilion, the crack of a signal, and then the explosion of movement across the frozen surface, dozens of men in motion simultaneously, their forms low and fast, each trying to arrive first at the position closest to the throne. The winner receives a reward from the emperor's hand. Then, the ball game. 2 teams, red and yellow jackets, a leather ball on the ice. The goal: drive it into the opposing team's net. This was descended from a traditional Manchu game played on foot. On ice, with blades, it became something faster and more chaotic, more collision, more improvisation, more noise. The centerpiece is something called the Dragon Formation Archery. A long line of skaters, hundreds of them, moves in a winding, serpentine formation across the ice. Seen from above, from the elevated pavilion, it resembles a dragon moving across the lake. Distributed through the formation are archers. At a designated point, they pass below a gate from which hangs a target ball. While moving at speed, in formation, they draw and shoot. Hit the ball, receive the reward. Miss it, and the dragon keeps moving, and the moment passes. There are also acrobatics, performers who do the same tricks on ice that stage acrobats do on platforms tumbling, human pyramids, one-legged balances. Some of them play instruments while skating. Some carry flags. Some combine sword handling with skating in choreographed displays that blend Han Chinese theatrical traditions with the Manchu skating culture. The Qianlong Emperor loved this event. He declared it a national custom and required it to be held annually. He commissioned paintings of it, the Bingxi scroll paintings that still exist in museum collections, showing hundreds of figures on a frozen lake, flags flying, the imperial pavilion watching from one shore, the formations moving in complex patterns across the ice. He wrote a formal essay about it, the imperially composed essay on ice sports, explaining its importance for maintaining the martial spirit of the banners, its connection to Manchu cultural traditions, its expression of imperial authority and peaceful prosperity. It was part military review, part cultural preservation, part theatrical spectacle. The emperor, watching his soldiers demonstrate skill on the frozen lake, was the dynasty showing itself to itself, reminding the court of where the Qing had come from. The northern ice and open landscapes and physical excellence that had carried them to Beijing, and power and the yellow tiles of the Forbidden City. The ice that supported these performances in winter was the same ice from the same lakes that would be cut and stored and distributed as summer relief in July, winter and summer meeting in the same frozen surface, the cold doing two entirely different kinds of work for the same dynasty in the same place, 6 months apart. The ice system served the court. The court was not the city of Beijing, with its hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, its merchants and craftsmen and laborers and servants and monks and beggars and soldiers and teachers, had its own relationship with summer heat, and that relationship involved no government cellar allocations, no wooden ice vessels inlaid with cloisonne, and, for most of the Qing period, no ice at all. Beyond the red walls, out through the gate, into the streets of Beijing. The summer heat is the same out here. If anything, it is worse. More people, narrower lanes, less stone and more dust, no garden to provide even the illusion of shade. The city is crowded and loud and hot, and no ice tickets are being distributed. For most of the Qing period, the law was clear. Ice harvesting was a state monopoly. Only government cellars and approved royal household cellars could operate. Private citizens could not harvest or store ice commercially. The common people had no legal access to the resource, not because anyone had decided to be deliberately cruel about it, but because the system had been designed to serve the court, and the court had never expanded the design to include anyone else. What ordinary people had instead, the well. Wells in Beijing were deep, and the water that came up was cooler than the ambient air. You could lower a watermelon on a rope and pull it up 20 minutes later, and it would be noticeably cooler than when it went down. Not ice cold, but meaningfully less hot. For someone working outside in July with no access to anything colder, this mattered. There were the cooked remedies, green bean soup, simmered and cooled. Sour plum soup, ume plums and hawthorn and licorice root and rock sugar, simmered for hours. Strained, cooled, and drunk. Various herbal teas with cooling properties. You might, walking through a summer alley at dusk, hear a vendor calling out with the particular rhythm of a Beijing street cry, the clinking of copper bowls, the words advertising cold plum soup, and know, without looking, what was being sold. The sound was part of summer, the summer sound of people trying to be less hot. Late in the Qing period, something changed. As the government's control over commerce loosened, private commercial ice operations began to appear. These were called civilian sellers, Mingjiao, run by merchants, smaller than the official sellers, more pragmatic in their operations, and in summer, they sold. The record from Yanjing Suishi Ji, a late Qing account of seasonal life in Beijing, mentions street vendors called binghur, who walked the summer streets with shoulder poles, carrying something cold and primitive, the distant ancestor of the popsicle. Simple, not expensive, but still not cheap enough for everyone. There is a particular kind of gap made visible by this contrast. Inside the walls, ice delivered on allocation, carried in lacquered boxes by eunuchs, drunk in cloisonné vessels, cold air escaping upward through coin-shaped ventilation holes into rooms full of silk and lacquer and careful stillness. Outside the walls, a vendor with a shoulder pole in the heat, well water, green bean soup, the sound of copper bowls in the evening. Same sun, same heat, not the same summer. Historians studying the social history of the Qing period note that the official records spend very little time on how ordinary people experienced extreme weather. The documents that survived were mostly generated by and for people with access to government systems. The experience of the majority, how they managed, what they used, what they paid, what they went without lives mostly in casual accounts, local records, and the kind of literature that didn't make it into the official archives. The real texture of summer in Beijing, for most of the people who actually lived there, is still being recovered. But the well is still there. In the old Hutong neighborhoods, the ring of stone at the top worn smooth by centuries of rope, still cool inside, even now, still offering, in its patient way, the only cold the street could provide. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, when two completely different ways of understanding coldness were operating simultaneously within a few miles of each other in coastal China, one that had been refined over 3,000 years and depended entirely on the rhythm of the natural seasons, and one that had been invented in an English workshop in 1834, and depended on compressed vapor and mechanical energy, and the world that resulted from that meeting was not the world that either tradition had anticipated. The Qing Dynasty had its own chemistry of cold, long before any Western influence arrived. In the late Tang period, over 1,000 years ago, craftsmen working with gunpowder ingredients discovered something unexpected. When potassium nitrate, called shaoxi, saltpeter dissolved in water, it absorbed heat from its surroundings. The water around the solution became cold, sometimes cold enough to freeze. This is endothermic dissolution, a chemical process, and the people who discovered it centuries before European scientists gave it that name. Summer ice made on demand. Without a cellar, without a frozen river, using a process that would not be formally described in Western chemistry until much later. The practical limitation was scale. Saltpeter ice was expensive to make and produced small quantities. It couldn't replace the cellars. It was useful for immediate, small-scale needs: chilling a drink, keeping a remedy cold, something quick and specific. Not 14,000 tons. Not a summer's worth of imperial coal. In 1834, in England, Jacob Perkins built the first continuously operating vapor compression refrigeration machine. It used ether as a refrigerant. It could produce cold indefinitely, as long as it had power and refrigerant. It did not require a frozen river. It did not require January. It was, in principle, seasonal independence. The decades after 1834 saw this technology develop and improve. And the decades after 1842, after the First Opium War opened, Chinese ports saw increasing numbers of Western merchants, missionaries, diplomats, and soldiers settling into treaty port communities. They brought with them goods and habits and ideas, and among those things were early awareness of, and eventually early examples of, mechanical refrigeration. You can imagine the scene. Somewhere in a foreign trading house in a treaty port, a machine that makes ice. People watching, not understanding the mechanism, understanding only the result that this device, this contraption of pipes and wheels, was producing cold without any winter, without any cellar, without any of the 3,000 years of institutional infrastructure that the same result required inside the Forbidden City. The Qing court's response to Western mechanical technology in this period was generally cautious. The instinct was to observe, to collect, occasionally to deploy in carefully limited contexts, but not to systematically incorporate into the way things were done. The methods that had worked for 3,000 years were not obviously broken. The harvest was still happening. The cellars were still filling. The tickets were still being issued. What historians are still working to document is the specific moment, which year, which institution, which person, when a mechanical refrigeration device was first seriously considered or used within an official Qing context. The records are sparse. The transition, when it came, was gradual and unannounced. Not the dramatic collision that the narrative arc might suggest. But something was beginning. In the foreign settlements on the coast, in the new skating clubs that appeared in Tianjin's concession areas in the 1880s, ice sports, imported from Europe, organized with European rules, alongside the traditional Manchu bingshi that had been declared a national custom a century earlier. Two very different relationships with cold were occupying the same geography, slowly becoming aware of each other. Not yet in direct conflict, not yet resolved. The river still freezes in January. The ice is still there, on the surface of the water, waiting, as it always has, for someone to come and cut it. Whether that someone will bother is the question that the coming century is quietly assembling. The end of the imperial ice system was not dramatic. There was no official ceremony of closure, no edict declaring the tradition concluded, no final allocation of tickets. The system simply became less necessary, then less practiced, then remembered, then studied. The cellars that had held the cold through half a year went quiet. Some were demolished. Some were repurposed. A few survived into the present, and if you visit them on a summer day, you can still feel, inside the thick walls, something that is not quite warmth. The Qing Dynasty weakens in stages through the 19th century. Wars lost, treaties signed at unfavorable terms, money flowing out, institutions losing their grip on their own procedures. The imperial ice system doesn't collapse all at once. The harvest happens for years after the First Opium War. The cellars fill. The tickets are issued. The Bing Ban keeps its ice. But around the edges of the system, things are shifting. Commercial, civilian cellars are becoming more common. Some of them operate through arrangements with princely households, using the status of a noble's name to cover operations that are commercially motivated. The monopoly that had kept ice away from ordinary commerce is more a formality now than an enforced reality. Ice is beginning, slowly, to become something that money can buy. And the mechanical alternative is developing. The first commercial ice plants appear in the treaty ports, ice produced by machine, not by January. Cheaper per unit as the technology matures, available in summer when the natural supply is most needed, not requiring a river, a cellar, 3 months of labor, a bureaucratic approval chain, or a favorable winter temperature. 1912. The Qing Dynasty ends. The institution that gave the imperial ice system its reason for existing is gone. The official cellars lose their mandate. Some close, some continue in altered forms, serving whatever institution or enterprise moves into the space. The Gongyi Hutong cellar near the Drum Tower in Beijing eventually becomes a restaurant, a place where people come to eat in a room that was designed to keep things cold, which has a particular atmosphere that no modern refrigeration can replicate. The Shueqi ice cellar, which had served the Qing court for the better part of 3 centuries, continued to operate for commercial ice storage until the 1970s. Decades after electric refrigerators had already entered Chinese homes in significant numbers. The design that worked in 1644 was still working in 1970. The thick walls and the arched vault and the drainage system had lost nothing of their function in 300 years. In the 1980s and after, household refrigerators became common, then widespread, then universal, and with that, the last reason to cut ice from frozen rivers and carry it to underground vaults disappeared from practical life. The tradition became history, then heritage, then, for most people, something that had to be explained before it could be appreciated. The workers who had cut ice from these rivers, whose fathers had cut ice, and their fathers before them found other work. What happened to them? Specifically, how the transition affected families, whose identity had been organized around a seasonal labor that no longer existed, is not well documented. They disappear from the record the same way they entered it, quietly, without individual names, as part of the background of history rather than its subject. Today, the Shuiqi Ice Cellar is a listed historical site. The Gongyi Hutong Cellars are a restaurant. In the Palace Museum, the Bingban sit in glass cases, the cloisonné one, the rosewood ones, the ones with copper fittings, beautiful objects, still functional, if you put ice in them. Still, as far as anyone can tell, the correct answer to the problem they were designed to solve. Push a button, ice appears. This is available to almost everyone now, at minimal cost, in a few hours. What it took to produce the same result in 1700, the rivers cleaned in autumn, the ice measured in December, the harvest in January, the stacking and sealing and waiting, the tickets and allocations and officials and workers and sleds and cellars and straw and drainage, all of that has become invisible. The cold arrives without a history, immediately, as though it were simply always there. Historians are still working through the records, still finding details in the archives, still recovering the full shape of a system that was, in its way, one of the most elaborate logistical operations in the pre-modern world, organized around a simple physical fact that in Beijing, winter is cold, and summer is hot, and someone decided, 3,000 years ago, to do something about the distance between them. The walls of the cellar are still thick, still cool to the touch in July, still holding something in that has no name now except the memory of cold. Closing. The temperature of history, what you carry out with you when you leave. The city is quiet now. The palace rooftops are still under a dark sky. The ice cellar walls are cold on one side and warm on the other, as they always were. And you have been carrying around this history long enough that it has done what cold things do. It has moved from the outside in, from information to something that rests in a different part of you. The night has settled in, fully dark now, the kind of darkness that feels deliberate and complete. You have been somewhere today, not far in distance, a long way in time. You stood in a summer courtyard and felt the heat between red walls. You followed the logic of cold backward through 3,000 years. You watched workers on a frozen river that no longer exists in the same form, cutting blocks of water that are gone now, carrying them to vaults that are still standing. You learned about a man whose job title was the Ice Official, and whose existence in a 2,000-year-old list of government positions is somehow both completely ordinary and quietly startling. You sat near a wooden box with coin-shaped holes in the lid, breathing cold air upward into a silk-curtained room, and understood, in some small way, what it was like to live inside a hierarchy where even the temperature you were permitted to experience depended on where you stood in the order of things. You watched an emperor on a frozen lake, watching hundreds of soldiers move in the shape of a dragon across the ice, and understood that this was not just entertainment, it was the dynasty reminding itself of who it was, where it came from, the cold it had come from, the cold it was still carrying. And you saw the system end, not with drama, with the quiet, gradual replacement of one answer to a question by a different, more efficient, far less interesting answer. The answer that now sits in the corner of almost every room, humming softly, keeping things cold, with no history attached to it at all. Let that settle. Let the history rest where it is, in the thick walls of cellars, in the coin holes of lacquered boxes, in the grooved floor tiles that channeled meltwater away, in the archives where the ice ticket budget lines still exist, patient and precise, waiting to be read. The room you are in is cooled without effort now, without a river, without a cellar, without 3 months of labor and a bureaucratic chain reaching from the winter ice to the summer court. Just electricity and compressed gas working quietly in a machine that never stops. Let yourself be cool. That's all. Nothing else is required. The walls of the palace are still standing in the dark. The cellar walls are still thick. The winter river still freezes in January. The ice is still there. On the surface of the water, crystalline and heavy and quiet, the way it has always been, waiting for morning and the sound of tools beginning their work. But that is for morning. That is for January. That is for another history, another day. For now, the room is cool. The night is quiet. The story is done. Good night.